Welcome back to the Curdverse. I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. Last time on the Curdverse, we talked about cheddar and other forms of traditional British cheeses. But since the 1980s, there has been an explosion in British cheesemaking, exploring a wide variety of different cheese types. So today, I invited our first guest onto the podcast, longtime British person Mike Nistor, to tell us about some of his favorite cheeses in the modern British cheesemaking scene. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Yes, pleasure to be here and talk cheese, absolutely.
So, Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship with cheese. What is your cheese origin story?
Well, it's an interesting story in many respects. So, I've been living in Britain for 30 odd years, but I was in fact born in Romania, which is quite exotic for most standards. And my love with cheese, I suppose, began when I was taken by my parents into the mountains for walks and things. But often we would pass shepherd huts, you see, and they still practice like they do in France over there, the transhuman's practice, which is essentially taking all the sheep in a village to the mountains for the summer, and then bring them back for the winter. So, of course, if you walk around, these sort of various. They're more or less huts, I suppose, but we often happen to be there when they were making cheese, and this is not, industrial. This is not even artisan to some extent. This was very much a way to preserve the milk and
Yeah.
to bring something back to the sheep owners to have in the meantime. And it was just marvelous. It was this sort of the whey was, then used in cooking after the process. They had their own little cultures, which, molded bread and so forth, and lots of other things, and taken stuff straight from the sheep themselves. And it was just fascinating as a process for me because I was at the age where the transition of one element to another, essentially the liquidity of the milk into the solidity of the curd, was just magic.
It is.
And
It is.
and it was that sort of feeling of independence in the mountains and a fish and the freshness and all that sort of stuff, and that stayed with me ever since. And that's how the sort of love for cheese began, and then obviously eating more and more of it, and now making it as well. So, and studying about it, part of the Academy of Cheese in London. So, yeah, that's the origin.
Awesome. So, what is the Academy of Cheese? I keep seeing things about it.
Yes, I mean the Academy of Cheese is an organization which is a non-profit, and it's designed specifically for the promotion of cheese making, cheese knowledge, and to a slightly lesser degree, British cheese. They've done tremendous work during COVID to support cheesemakers in various respects, organizing, for example, cheese weekenders, where online, where people were introduced to cheese and various experts were talking about it and so forth, and promoting British cheese. And they run courses where you can either learn with a tutor or by yourself in the first phases, the basics of cheese making, of cheese tasting. Um, there is a cheesemaker in England, a cheddar cheesemaker, which is making cheese for hundreds of years, and is Quick's cheddar, they're called. And Mary Quick is the latest in a very long line of cheesemakers. And she's starting a project which has been taken with the Academy of Cheese to standardize, if you like, cheese tasting. Now, what that means isn't obviously to impose a certain dogma on the tastes or on the cheese, on cheese lovers, but it was more or less to find common language when we talk about cheese. So, for example, if I told you something like like a bloomy rind, you know exactly what I mean. And if I describe a slightly animal or slightly mineral taste, you'll probably know what that is as well. So, the Academy of Cheese is very much part of the project a project to standardize this sort of cheese and tasting and find common ground in England. Yeah.
Very cool. So, how would you describe sort of a classic British cheese, as distinct from other cheeses from other parts of the world?
Well, the interesting thing about British cheese, I think, it's there are two things. Which to my knowledge and to my sort of studying has shown. Firstly, British cheese was damaged tremendously in the early part of the 20th century, right after the war, and slightly before by the Milk Marketing Board, which essentially was a body which was created to supervise the price and the production of milk. But actually, people who made milk and then used it for cheese were paid less per gallon than people who actually used it for milk, for drinking, and so on. Um, so there was a great discouragement in those days for cheese making in some respect, and there was a bit of a revolution in the 70s and onwards, and there's a tremendous character called Patrick Rance, who basically led a crusade to use raw milk again and to actually get back to if you like a spirit of kind of 19th century British cheese. Because of all this, and again, obviously one can read more about it, and I don't want to sort of lecture about it anyway. But um, British cheese is just emerging from a straitjacket in many respects, and I would say we are living into sort of the golden age of British cheese, where a lot of the stuff that was either ignored or sort of unsupported is now blooming, and we have lots of lovely cheeses, and soon to rival the French, I would say, in many respects, and in some cases overpass it. And I sort of got an example for that. So in that context, I mean, I would say you can talk about the greats, about the Wensleydales and the Lancashires and the Cheshires and all the rest of it, but obviously cheddar is you can't talk about English cheese without mentioning cheddar.
Of course.
And the problem we have is that when I say cheddar, we have these kind of visions of this sort of fairly soulless blocks of yellowish, mess, which are sort of plasticky looking a bit and look a bit untidy and look a bit false and Lego-ish and so on. And that's actually couldn't be further from the truth. What's actually being produced now. We actually recently had the first affineur of the year competition in England, where Mary Quick provided 12 cheeses to 12 different affineurs, and obviously they all treated it in different ways. And it was wonderful to be part of that event and to see how cheese actually, well, how the same block of 3 month old cheddar can develop and grow into something wonderful at the end, and so diverse. There are lots of great cheddars, and you have your Keens and Montgomerys and obviously the Quicks and others, but the one produced by the Trethome brothers in the west part of the country, I think they're based at Weston-super-Mare. That's probably, I would say, is one of the pinnacles of British cheese at the moment in terms of cheddar. And there's two reasons for this. So firstly, they only do Cafelli, Gorywood Cafelli, it's called, and the Pitchfork, which is the cheddar, which actually I think won the world. I think came second or third in the World Cheese competition in 2019. But what they do with it is twofold. Firstly, they have very old presses, so they actually went around the country collecting almost antique cheese presses, which they actually still use now. I think that there's an anecdote about them finding one in a pub and picking it up for a couple of pounds just because nobody knew what it actually was.
Yeah.
And the secondly is what they do is they have a fairly sort of gravity defying, or actually gravity led mechanism to pour the milk. So what they're very keen on is not to force the milk through a tube and therefore displace the fats and all the rest of it. So they feed it into this kind of almost overhanging vat, if you like, which then pours it fairly, just basically using gravity, pours it into the cooking vat. And I think that gives the cheddar a lot of personality, which it's far removed from the visions of British cheddar which we have in the 70s and so on. And I don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be a purist, I'm not trying to be a snob, and there's a place for commercially produced cheddar out there, and so forth. But I think in terms of getting close to the spirit of British cheddar, I'll say that the Pitchfork is probably the best.
Very good. When you were talking about the milk board, was it when you said that was the early part of the 20th century? Was that sort of before World War II? Was it between the wars? When did all that start?
It started in early, actually. It started before the wars, but after First War. But I mean, he actually went all the way. I think he was only disbanded in. I think it started, if I remember correctly, it stopped operating in 1990s, and actually was totally
Hmm.
disbanded only a couple of years ago. albeit its role has changed. The thinking at the time was very much a sort of a war and an efficiency drive and a war policy where we need this very nutritious substance as milk, and we need it for to be consumed rather than be, if you like, played around with in terms of making cheese.
Mm.
Um, so therefore, the concept of terroir, which the French have, like there's this particular type of milk and a particular type of region with coming from animals which were particularly all this sort of stuff, it was quite foreign to Britain until quite recently. It was a very
Mm.
functional approach, and actually, if you look at the penicillin, for example, content of milk in the sort of late 80s was a lot higher than most European countries, purely because of the way the animals were fed, and that obviously transported into the milk. So until I would say about the 80s, and I say there's about some, the 1990s is when the revolution really started. The quality of the milk used for cheese, not the quality of milk overall, was subpar in many respects.
Mm.
To produce something that we would call, world beating artisan cheese. So it was very much a war creation, if you like, and a war policy, and you could see why it was done. Maybe the mystery isn't that it was done, but why it survived so long. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
All right. Well, why don't we take a tour around Britain? Um, I think for those of us outside of the UK, of course, we all know cheddar. We don't necessarily know good cheddar, but we all know cheddar. But I think there are a whole slew of cheeses from all parts of Britain that perhaps are a little less known. And so I was hoping maybe we could tour the country a little bit with you. Maybe you could tell us about some of your favorites. And why don't we start in Kent, and then
Yeah,
we'll head west to the West Country and
absolutely. I mean,
go
the,
from
the
there.
the the great thing that we have in UK at the moment is that it's almost like the cheese industry is it no longer has a straitjacket around it. So, for example, in France, if you want to produce camembert, and I know it's produced all over the country, but if you want to be considered seriously, it has to be Normandy based.
Yeah.
If you look at something like Abondance, for example, it has to come from the village of Abondance, from Abondance cows, and
Yeah.
that's that. Now, Abondance is a fantastic Alpine cheese, no doubt, but in a sense it has a straitjacket. It can't evolve beyond what it is, although what it is fantastic,
Mhm.
because it has to be produced at very, very specific and very, very exacting standards. In a sense, what we have in Britain, where we don't have so many OAPs and so many OAX and all the rest of it, is that there is that license to innovate at the moment. There is a license to, okay, we don't have the terroir in a way which the French understand it just yet. Maybe it's just emerging, and there is license to create and to do a lot of different stuff. Um, and COVID was a tremendous example for this. So, for example, we usually expect to have about 5, 6 new cheeses a year, new creations, if you like. I mean, during COVID, it was 30 odd a year because a lot of people that, for example, were making soft cheese, all of a sudden found that they had to make hard cheese because they couldn't sell it. So they had to make something that will last longer, hopefully, by the time that they were maturing, the pandemic was over and they could go back to whatever. So there's a lot of creations in this way. From that point of view, we have if somebody from the 70s wouldn't recognize the many cheeses we have today, and that's why I think what I want to mention isn't necessarily the classics, the stalwarts, as good as they are. I think it'll be interesting to look at some of the newer stuff that maybe isn't so obvious. So in Kent, I mean, we have the cheesemakers of Canterbury, who until very much the sort of early 90s were fairly like a quite respectable but small dairy outfit, and have now grown into they were in a place called Dargate, sort of between just outside Canterbury and which is probably the best well-known place. But they were making excellent cheese, but now they've discovered they do two fantastic things. So the first one is Ashmore, which is a very hard cooked cheese, slightly crystalline if you leave it too long, but it's even sort of it's got cheddar qualities if you like, but it's harder than cheddar. So it's a proper sort of hard cheese, and then that's the Ashmore Farmhouse, and then they do something called a Darkgate Dumpy, which is a camembert wannabe, but it's more or less with
And is it
local
with you? You
qualities.
said that was also
And
goat,
the
or
No, no, they're not, not
Okay.
goats. They're both cow milk. There is something called Ellie's goat cheese, which is local in Kent, but that's pretty much fresh goat cheese as opposed to matured. But Ashmore is matured for a number of months between 6 and 12, whereas the Dagge Dumpy, the so camembert type is of about 6 weeks or so. Interestingly, though, they can't meet, although Kent is all often thought of the Garden of England, they can't meet the needs they have for milk just from Kent. So actually, they go up north to pick up some of the milk from um, uh, Stratford upon Avon, so Shakespeare's place and all the rest of it. So actually, funnily enough, some of the milk they use down here, it's actually coming from
Hmm.
hundreds of miles away. That's purely in terms of demand. There's so much demand locally that they just can't. They don't have enough to make the cheeses. But those two, I would say, so the Ashmont specifically is being nationally recognised as a very
Hmm.
very good hard cheese. So that'll be sort of Kent. And I mean, Baron Bygod, which is probably our next, I would say, our next cheese that is worth a mention. I mean, Raymond Blanc, the sort of renowned French chef, called it that it's better than Brie de Mieux, which is for a Frenchman to say that. I would say that's
That's
almost
nearly sacrilege.
paramount to
Yes.
treason, really. Yes, it is. So I think if he said it's that good, then it is. And this is a very classic brie type. It's quite runny. And wonderful thing about the Baron is that the more you leave it, you can go from sort of fairly chalky paste. You can see that it's young and it's still nice, but it's got relatively um, wet
Hmm.
chalk feel to it, and then as you leave it along, then it just becomes sort of runnier, sort of creamier, sort of notes of cabbage and so on. So it's a lovely lovely cheese in many respects. So I would say that cheesemakers of Canterbury are very dear to me because they're so close to where I live, but the Baron would be the first cheese which I'll say has national recognition for being excellent, and international as well. And they've recently started producing something with truffle, which is, you know, if you like truffle, it's
Yeah.
outstanding. So yeah.
So if we head west from Kent, Somerset, of course, is the home of cheddar. But are there spots we should stop off in between before we get to
Yes.
Somerset?
Yes, I mean, there's something fairly close by called there's a Cote Blue, sorry, Cot Blue, there's a Cot Hill is the farm, but the Cot Blue is the one that's most famous, and is run by the Davenports. They're again relatively traditional cheesemakers, but now they've had sort of new life infused into them by their son, who's come to help. And they make a lot of Cot Hill cheeses, but the Cot Blue is specifically good, and it's been recognized as such. In a country that produces Stilton, it's difficult to talk about blue cheeses, and I'll be the first to say that blue cheese as a whole. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, look, I eat any cheese, but it's not my go-to blue cheese. But the Code Blue is fantastic in its own right because it's a lot creamier, and it has very much the so it's not the crumbly type, but it's not it's powerful without being overwhelming. But what I like about it is it has that essence of animal in it. I don't know how to say it
Yeah,
without
yeah, yeah,
sounding
yeah. I understand.
funny, but it tastes of cow. You see what I mean? You can feel, it's got a very powerful animal element, and I think if you're not good with very powerful smells or tastes, then it's probably not the cheese for you.
Well, I think that it's actually really interesting, especially given your cheese origin story. I think for a lot of people who are used to sort of mass-produced supermarket cheeses, that whole concept of tasting the farm and tasting the animal and so forth is
Mm.
is very very strange. But I think that if you're more accustomed to that, and you're with your early experiences with very local cheese, I think that absolutely makes sense to me that you would sort of gravitate to something like
It
that.
is, and the thing is, I don't mind. I mean, again, I repeat, I eat any cheese, and one of my, I do a bit of social media and so forth, but one of my strongest desires is to not be unnecessarily critical. Now, it doesn't mean not to be discerning, but I don't like, the in a society in which basically we just go out there with a pure purpose of talking things down. I'm quite the opposite. I want to talk things up. So, and I do that. So, just because I say I like a particular cheese, I don't necessarily mean that creamery cheese or mass-produced cheese has no place. That's not it. But
Mm.
I don't like cheeses which are gimmicky, particularly. So things that've got lots of fruit in it, or they've got marmite in it, or coffee in it, or chocolate in it, or whatever. I like my cheeses to have the personality of whatever they come from, and I think in terms of blue cheese, I mean, there's another one. It is from Scotland called Isle of Mull blue, and I mean that one is the strongest blue I've ever had. It's marbled, and that one really is like this is not for the beginnings. You only put that on a board if you're aware that your audience can take it. That's one of those. It's like you could kind of feel the very sharp Scottish winds in it. I mean, it's just so powerful. Whereas this one, it's very much.
It's one you drink with a really peaty scotch
It,
with.
it will lend itself very much to that drink, yes. Whereas this one, it's very much different. It's not just because it's creamier but it's got a very sort of thin. It almost looks like a Morbier, but instead of that ash line in the middle, it's a blue line. So it's slightly more mellow, but at the same time, it's incredibly powerful in terms of the sort of raw animal taste in a good way. Um, so it's kind of going slightly sort of that way. I think it's Lincolnshire where they originally are, but I think they're slightly more south than that. But that would certainly be my, if I were to build a cheese board here, I would certainly go for the Baron and then the Cold Blue. Um, but the one I really want to mention is there's a cheesemaker called at Kingstone Dairy, which is a chap called David Jowett, and he's won so many prizes, unreal. He's some people get so big weak at the knee when they see rock stars or movie stars or whatever. I have these feelings with cheesemakers. I'm a I don't stalk them instantly, but it's just they have the same effect on me. And I think David Jarvis is pretty much a rock star when it comes to British cheese. And he's started very young, and I think he's worked at a couple before he's settled at a sort of Kingston. But he makes the roll right, which is this kind of very Livarot sounding cheese, which is sort of it's sort of surrounded by spruce binding to keep its shape, and it's sort of washed rind, and it's talking about Scottish whiskies. It's very much where the smell and the overall aroma is more powerful than actual taste. When you actually taste, it's so mellow and it's so surprising and so subtle. But when you actually smell that, when you unpack it and smell the first thing, you think, okay, I'm in for it here.
Yeah.
But when you actually taste it, it's just phenomenal. Raw milk.
And I'm sorry, what was the name of that cheese?
Roll right, roll right.
And is that also a Scottish cheese or?
No, no, that's David Jarno. He's English. He's an English producer, and but he does. He's basically does now. He does Evan Load, which is again another washed or even load, I should say, another washed rind cheese, which is quite phenomenal. It reminds one of the sort of Moroi or Moray or Moroi.
Maroy, yeah.
Mara, that's it. That's it. Sorry, yes. My tongue's not doing the thing. Yes, in France, which is sort of fairly sticky, washed
Hmm.
rind, but quite pungent. But again, ultimately quite delicate when you get to it. And of course, his Morbier wannabe called Ashcombe, which is unashamedly a copy of Morbier.
Hmm.
But as he said, it's a British Morbier, and I think that's a cheese that you don't associate with England. And I think the reason I like him because he produces cheeses that you normally associate with the continent in many
Hmm.
respects. When you think England traditionally, and I suppose that's why I want to mention him, is because he is the new era of British cheese. When you talk about England, you have these visions of these wheels of sort of fairly hard, flavoursome but cooked cheeses. Your sort of Lancaster, Cheshire, Lancaster, all that, cheddars and so forth. Whereas this is, I think, Britain's discovered subtlety when it comes to cheese. There's a lot more cheese now that is techniques are different, invention is different, and yes, some like this Ashcombe is okay. It is like a Morbier, and it's meant to be like a Morbier, but it's very much a British take on it.
How so?
Um, well, it's basically got a. It's just it. Firstly, the texture is slightly more toffee-esque for a start.
Okay.
But secondly, is the taste. So Morbier is a lot more subtle in many respects. It's a little bit more. I won't call it refined because that's not the right word, but it's somewhat smoother on a tongue. I mean, whereas the Ashcombe is slightly more, it deconstructs rather than melts, if that makes any sense
Yeah.
on the tongue,
Yep.
for one thing. And secondly, it's just got that extra bit of um, I won't call it nuttiness, but also almost like floral element to it, which I don't think the original Moby does.
No, no, it is
Um,
definitely a more mild cheese.
so yeah, so I think the original is slightly nuttier, slightly even more caramelly in the same extent. But this one, it's I would say it's more pastoral than anything, you know.
Hmm.
Whereas they, if you put them side to side, you probably wouldn't notice much of a difference. But when you actually put them in the mouth, they are different. So David Jowett and his cheeses, they say, I certainly would, if anyone ever comes to the UK and say, all right, you know something, I really want a piece of cheese, I'll go for a roll right. He actually does now mini roll rights, which are individual portions, so you can actually have one or share one rather than a because the original roll right is more like a livaro, which is sort of like a
Okay.
plate size, so yeah, so he would be certainly one that I would recommend. So Middle England is mostly, um, and I mean going towards the West Country, as I say, I mean the Trethorn brothers that do amazing stuff, and their Caerphilly is sensational. And the reason
Is
is,
Caerphilly
yeah,
only made in Wales, or are there English producers as well?
well, it's technically only made in Wales, but they are now moved out of Wales and produce it in England.
Okay.
Um, and what I like about it is that it's bitter. As essence, it's bitter. It's a bitter cheese, but it's not a bitter cheese that is unpleasant. It's a bitterness which is almost like, like drinking a cup of coffee without milk or sugar.
Hmm.
There's a bitterness, but the bitterness isn't the overwhelming feeling. It's the flavor, and the way they do that is just spectacular. And especially as Caerphilly is a cheese that doesn't need to mature for a huge period of time. It's about sort of 2 weeks up to a month and so forth. But it's just, I don't know how they pack it quite so much. I think again it must be the way that the fat is not separated or whatever. I'm not sure, but the Caerphilly in the west part of the country is special. Um, and incidentally, I mean, the reason it wasn't meant to be matured for too long is because it was a staple. It was one of those things that you made, and then you had it on the mine and so on and so forth. And incidentally, the rind is fairly hard and actually quite unkept, if you see what I mean, because it wasn't supposed to be pretty. It was supposed to be something that dirty hands could hold while you have the paste, and then you discard it. So it was a very functional cheese in many respects.
Yeah.
And I think that the Trethone certainly elevated it. I think to a gourmet, experience.
Well, I think that's what people often sort of forget, in when we talk about cheese today is, because it's sort of becoming this luxury good. A lot of people forget that it was a meat substitute for the working class and middle class for centuries, right? And
Yeah, absolutely.
there's nothing wrong with that.
Not all, and I mean the Welsh. In fact, they've got a reputation for being very clever with their food. I mean, the famous Cornish pasty was designed to have a main course and a pudding in one. So, in one side of the pasty you had the meat and veg and what have you, and then a wall of dough would separate the other corner, which would have jam and something sweet in it. So a worker down the mine could just basically bite into the meaty end, if you like, and then have the pudding after. So there is a history of very functional food in Wales in that respect, which you know. But yeah, the Caerphilly they produced just over the border actually in the West Country, but it's special as well.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean it's and I mean one notable thing that I will also say. I mean, if we move slightly across the border. Across the sea, I should say. I mean, I know we're talking about Britain, and I know the Republic of Ireland is very much an independent place, and I wouldn't want to
Step on
you
toes.
know, no, I've got Irish friends and I know how important that is. So I wouldn't want to associate Ireland with England or with Britain in this respect. But what I would say is that there's an Irish cheese called Gabine, which is absolutely fantastic in many respects. It's a sort of fairly moist, slightly holy but moist paste, and part of the reason for that is and it is deconstructed in a very special way. They make it in a farm where there is this this actual bacteria which was called it's something gubinese or something like that. I can't quite, Streptococcus gubinese, something like that. I can't quite remember the exact words now. I can look it up, which you can't really find anywhere else in the world. And this is embedded into the walls of the dairy,
Hmm.
and they've tried to replicate it in many other culture, in the culture in many other ways, and they couldn't. And it's very much a unique cheese because of that.
Yeah.
And it has got a very, very specific flavor, slightly salty, and again quite mineral in that respect. But it's lovely. It's a bit like the Celes, the cheeses in France, which they've got particular vats with a particular culture they can't really replicate. So I would say that's a notable. I mean, the islands have got lovely cheeses in many respects, but this one is special because it's so unique. Um,
Hmm.
and then going further towards the Northern Island, there's a chap called Mike Thompson. He has a lovely shop called Mike's Fancy Cheeses. He's very, very approachable and amenable character, and
Where's the shop?
he's in Belfast.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, and he does a young buck, which is a blue cheese, and again, it's very much unrepented blue that will overtake. It's one of those cheeses that you don't want to have first on a board, because then you probably won't be able to taste
Taste
anything
anything else?
else. It will completely but in a nice way. But it's a what we like to call a cheese that likes to conquer. It doesn't just it doesn't just go on a palate and then slowly drifts away. This one will linger. And I mean, I've had the pleasure of having a piece which I did actually experiment, where I had it when I was first sent to me, and then I left it just deliberately to see what happens. And it didn't mellow with age; it just got even more fierce. So, but it's a very, very nice cheese. It's a proper blue. It doesn't have any of the complexities, if you like, of a Stilton or a but there's actually a new brand now called Stitchelton, which
Hmm.
is basically Stilton, but it's not made in Stilton in that
It's raw
village.
milk. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's more or less the same thing. It's just that it can't be called Stilton, so it's
Right.
called Stilton. But it's the same sort of thing. It's just I suppose a naming convention.
Yeah.
So yeah, so as I say, that all this stuff, and again, if we were to have this conversation 20 years ago, even let alone 30, none of this stuff would be around. You would still be talking about cheddar as the staple, as the defining, the definitive British cheese. And I generally don't think that's the case anymore. And you have Old Roan Wensleydale now, which is another Wensleydale type cheese with a difference. It's kind of moved on from that kind of staple north of England cheese. The Old Roan it's got different profile these days. It's a lot sort of lighter, more subtle. It's that kind of a fulfilling, almost fudgy kind of paste. Again, that's phenomenal. There's Hafford, I think, which is another sort of cheddary type, but without being quite cheddar.
Hmm.
And all these are relatively new. I mean, Wensleydale is new as a creation, but this variation of it is quite new,
Hmm.
and it's quite exciting as well. I've got to confess, I mean, I've always had Wensleydale, and I've fairly enjoyed it, but it wouldn't necessarily be my go-to cheese. But all Roan, I'll happily have it all day long. It's completely different in that respect. It has traditional notes. You still recognize it's a Wensleydale, but because it got that creaminess and that kind of a richness to it, but it's just more subtle.
Hmm.
Um, and also need to mention the Cinnerton Hill, which is probably one of the best goat cheeses I've had for the last 5 years. It's a kind of not quite a pyramid, but it's a half pyramid shape creation, which is sort of very soft, sort of gooey center, if you like, for goat cheese, and it's a little classic, quite ripe, but quite sort of lactic
Hmm.
rind, and it's made in close to a hill called Cinderton, hence the name. And it's
Actually,
one of
just
the those.
a quick question on that. So,
Sure,
I
yeah,
mean,
sure.
normally when you think about British cheeses, you usually you almost sort of assume cow's milk, although of course there are lots of sheep in England as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Are there more sheep and goat cheeses sort of emerging now, or?
Very much. I mean, goat cheese is still seen as very much as a niche taste. I personally love it, but it is, and there are some very, very, you know, um, competent goat cheeses, very very common. Uh, Out of which, as I said, this particular one is the pinnacle of it. The best, I mean, in terms of sheep, there's Berkswell, and I mean the Berkswell is the reason I love Berkswell as that's a sheep cheese is because I saw an interview with the chap, I can't remember the name now, but the chap's making it, and they could tell you a good batch from a bad batch purely on the number of little indentations that are left after um, you remove the molds. Because they said if those indentations are too pronounced, that means we didn't have enough staff that day to take them out when we should, so they were staying in the mold for far too long. And I mean that level of detail, which as an amateur cheesemakers, obviously I noticed them, but I won't tell you. And remember, I make my batches are sort of 8 to 10 cheeses and so forth, at the time. Um, but that level of detail in a professional outfit, that makes it's phenomenal. And Berkswell is in terms of sheep cheese is just is outstanding. And I think with things like Trethoven and with things like the Berkswell, I think they have their own animals. They look after their own production as well. So some of the others have to get milk where they can, but these two actually make sure that they have the cattle and the sheep and whatever on site, and they look after them in a way in which they would like to. For milk. And I think this is why I think that whole idea of terroir is now becoming a thing in England, where it's just not enough that we get the milk, like for all the right reason. I understand what the cheesemakers of Canterbury do, and I'm not
Yeah.
having a go in any respect. But would you call that a Canterbury or Kent cheese? Well, if the milk is essentially coming from north of England, probably not. But as nice as it is, whereas these guys, as I say, I think they are taking that to a different level, and they are now looking into producing that very specific individual taste. So yeah, Berkswell is a great example of a sheep cheese, which is again a cut above the rest, I think.
Very nice. And if someone were coming into England, just say for a couple of days for a conference or a quick visit, and we're only going to London,
Mhm.
where could one go to find some of these cheeses in London?
Well, luckily, there's actually increasingly a number of places where you can. I mean, but I think Paxton and Whitfield, Neal's Yard, those are two very, very, very good cheese shops, cheesemongers. I say I don't really want to call them cheesemongers because they actually do a lot of affinage on site as well. They have deals with the producers where they get the cheese in relatively young, and then they actually mature it on site, and then but those two, I would say, if I were to go to London and say, right, I've only got one day here, which one I would choose, it'll be one of those two to get the best British cheese around at the moment and have a chance to also get the relevant stock. So it's one thing to
Mhm.
order online and say, okay, well I can wait 4 weeks for this to be delivered or whatever, but to actually have it on site and I can taste it and take it away. And not just that, but the level of knowledge that those guys have as well, and be able to tell you a lot about what they hold. So that's why I think calling the cheese shop or cheesemonger is limiting in many respects.
All right. Well, I think we could probably talk all day, but I think that's probably a great place to stop.
Quite.
Mike, where can people find you on Twitter if they want to know more?
Well, I yes, I'm on Twitter as This Is the Way, which is a Star Warsy pun, I suppose, because of trying to combine my two passions. Obviously, way.
That's Way, Whey. Yeah.
Indeed, yes, indeed, yes, it is. And on Instagram, I'm just like myself, Mister, and but always happy to interact in any way, and pictures, books, articles, and so forth. So I'm always up to talk about cheese.
All right. And I have one final question. You have it appears, at least one whole wedge of cheese every single day. Do you really eat that much cheese?
Yes, it's just, I put a notification very early on when I started talking about cheese online, and it says it's about honesty and about trust, and I think this is what some people appreciate. Firstly, any photograph that I put there is a cheese that I've photographed and eaten myself. If that's not the case, I will say so. I would say this is something else. But everything that's photographed is eaten. None of it is thrown away. Every single thing that I have, I mean, I might not finish it in the same day, but every single thing I eat to the last morsel, without fail.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, Mike, and I hope that more people will find you and hit you up to talk about cheese.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks for joining me and Mike this episode. Next time on the Curdverse, I'll have another interview, this time with Perry Wakeman, head of cheese at Rennet and Rind, also in the UK, and we'll be talking about the fine art of affinage. So join us again next time as we once again enter the Curdverse.